Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, you're good to go.
Very good. Okay. So yeah, I was delighted to be invited to speak to your group about Boxwood Blight. And, I didn't even realize it was the 10-year anniversary of Boxwood Blight until I started preparing this presentation. It still seems like a pretty new disease to us. But the good news is that as of 2021, Boxwood Blight has been eradicated in the United States. So there's really no reason for my talk today. But I will tell you that that is unfortunately an April Fool's joke.
Terrible.
Probably not. Okay, maybe it's worse than the joke my husband played on me this morning when he came and told me there was no more coffee. That was pretty bad. There was coffee. Anyway, I want to talk to you today about Boxwood Blight. Unfortunately, we don't have a nice silver bullet for Boxwood Blight, and it is still happily spreading in Virginia. Let me move this thing out of the way here. Okay. So I prepared my talk today based on some questions that we gathered. I worked with Adria Bordas, who's the extension agent in Fairfax County, to try to document all these questions that we were getting about Boxwood Blight. So we sent out a survey, and we had a lot of questions that had come into the plant disease clinic. And so my talk today will be in part, answering some of those questions that we got in our frequently asked questions survey in 2018. And one of the questions that came up that I think probably you all are interested in is, do you expect cases of Boxwood Blight to increase in Virginia? So unfortunately, my April Fool's joke is not true. And to answer that question, I will give you the very gray and unsatisfying answer of it depends. And in 2018, we were really wondering what was going on. So as Bill said, we've had this disease around for a decade. It first came into Virginia in 2011 and was found in several other states on the East Coast at that time. And you can look at the samples that we got in the plant disease clinic at Virginia Tech. Our lab is a service lab to the county extension agents all across the state. So we get samples sent to us from every county in the state. And, while it's not a, set of survey samples, it is often representative of what's going on out there. So you can see that on this graph in 2011, we just had 2 samples in that were diagnosed positive with Boxwood Blight. That was the introduction. And over the next 4 years, we saw a little bit of an increase, but not a really significant increase until 2016. And this happened in response to an event that I'll tell you about in more detail in a little bit. There was a big box store that was unwittingly selling infected plants. And so these were being transplanted into the landscape. And we started noticing that we were getting a lot more boxwood samples in general in the clinic. The orange line shows the number of boxwood samples that we got in the clinic over the course of a year. And then the green line shows you how many of those samples were diagnosed positive for Boxwood Blight. So we saw this kind of jump in Boxwood Blight positive samples. We wanted to know what was going on. And we tracked it back to people introducing plants from a certain big box store, and these plants were infected. And so in 2017, we again saw about the same number of samples, but in 2018, we saw this major jump in samples. And that was a very rainy year. And so part of what the it depends answer depends on is the weather. And so in a rainy year, the rain, prolonged leaf wetness is really conducive to this disease, especially at moderate temperatures. So we saw a huge jump in samples at that time. And of course, because of that earlier introduction in 2016, there was enough fungal inoculum out there to spread around once the weather conditions were right. Now you see that the sample load of the total Boxwood blight positive samples went way down in 2019. That was a drought year. So it really does make a difference depending on the weather. But this disease is definitely out there. So let's talk a little bit about boxwood blight biology and how this disease works. Let's see if I can move this thing up, maybe. I'm seeing these. Are you guys seeing that little thing showing people entering on my screen? Has anybody seen that? Bill? You're muted.
Yeah, we see it. We see it.
I don't know if I can move that out
I
of
don't,
the way.
We've got it.
I guess not. Okay, I guess you guys will have to deal with that.
yeah,
Okay.
I don't have that, yeah.
Okay, so let's just talk about what causes boxwood blight. It's a fungus, and these fungi have these long Latin names. This one is called Calanectria pseudonaviculata. Its earlier name was Cylindrocladium pseudonaviculata, but in any case, you'll probably mostly refer to it as boxwood blight. But it is a fungal disease, and fungi they reproduce by means of structures called spores, which are usually microscopic. But if you get a bunch of them together, you might actually be able to see them. And the boxwood blight fungus produces its spores in these sticky little masses that look kind of star-shaped. They're white. And they're produced on the infected leaves and the young green stems, infected stems. And in addition to these spores, the fungus produces structures called microsclerotia that are long-lived structures that can survive periods of extremes in temperature and moisture. And so they're sort of dormant, but they're there and can cause new infections later when the weather conditions are right. Now, the fact that those spores are in these sticky masses means that they are not easily dislodged by air currents. So this fungus doesn't spread very easily by wind, which is a good thing. So how do you tell if your plants have boxwood blight? A lot of these questions were ones that came up in our frequently asked questions survey, and I'll be answering them as we go along. So the way to tell is to look for these characteristic symptoms. There are several of them. So leaf spots are an early symptom, and you can see them here. Sometimes people don't notice the disease at that phase, so you might miss that. But if you catch it early, you'll see these roughly circular leaf spots with a dark border and a tan center. Later, those leaves turn completely brown, and then you won't be able to see the leaf spots. One of the symptoms that's very characteristic is these black stripes on the green stems, and those are lesions that are caused by the fungus. So that's something to look for. There's not many other things that will cause that on boxwood stems. But a lot of times the first symptom that people notice is this severe defoliation. So seemingly overnight, lots and lots of the leaves will simply drop from the plant. And that's something we never saw before 2011. We had boxwood diseases that were root diseases that would cause, sections of the plant to turn brown, but those leaves would stay on the plant. And with boxwood blight, it was very different. The leaves would drop very suddenly from the plant. And the disease was also different from these root diseases in that this pathogen does not, to our knowledge, infect the roots normally. So the roots would be healthy, but we'd still be getting all this leaf drop on the plants. So those are some of the key symptoms to look for if you're trying to figure out whether your boxwood has boxwood blight or not. And, people also ask, does boxwood blight only affect boxwood? So the answer to that is no. It will infect other plants in the boxwood family. We don't have a lot of other plants that people use in the landscape that are in the boxwood family, but one of the common ones is Japanese spurge or Pachysandra terminalis, very commonly used as a ground cover. That can get the leaf spots that this fungus can cause. And a couple of other related plants, native plant Allegheny spurge can get the leaf spots, as well as sweet box or Sarcococca. So those are some other landscape plants that might possibly have the disease. Those plants don't, show these severe symptoms of severe browning and leaf drop. So you might not notice the disease on those plants. Now, as far as plants outside the boxwood family, plant pathologists have worked in the lab to try and see what other plants they can infect, and they can, in a laboratory setting, get infection of unrelated plants. But we have no documented cases of plants outside the boxwood family being infected in the landscape. So we think it's pretty safe to, if you don't have plants in the boxwood family, you're not going to have to worry about this disease. So how does it spread? If it's not easily spread by wind because of those sticky spore masses, then how is it spread? Well, we certainly, in the very beginning of this epidemic, we're seeing the main means of spread being introduction of infected plants. And so people didn't know they were introducing a plant that had lesions on the leaves, and then the fungus sporulated and those spores spread to plants that were nearby. And I think this picture is very indicative of some of what was happening back in the early phases of this epidemic. This picture was taken by Adria Bordas up in Fairfax County at the home of a boxwood enthusiast. You can see she's got quite a lot of boxwood here, and she even wanted to put boxwood in the containers on the patio. And you'll notice that that plant on the right doesn't look that great. And so it had browning of leaves and leaf drop, and the woman had one plant in that container, boxwood plant, that showed those symptoms, and she brought it back to the retail center, and then she got another plant that replaced it, and it developed the same symptoms. And so by the time she brought it into the extension office for diagnosis, it had reached this point, and Adria went out and took the pictures. So what we think happened here was that, the boxwood in the container had the disease, and then those spores, which formed on the leaves, were washed off of that plant, down the patio, down to those English boxwood right below the patio. And you can see how bad those plants look. They have a lot of defoliation. They were perfectly green prior to the introduction of this plant. So definitely introducing diseased plant material is still a major means of spread, and certainly was what got things started in Virginia. But are there other means of transmission? And certainly there are. Once those plants were out there and we had the fungus out there, on plants in the landscape, then that, pruning might be a problem, especially with boxwood. And you guys are well aware of that down in your area. The boxwood is used a lot in hedges and for topiary, and it tolerates pruning well. That's one of the really great things about boxwood, is that you can prune it back and it'll keep growing back. So the spores can survive for a certain amount of time on pruning tools. And then of course you have those microsclerotia that could be present as well and produce spores later on. So spreading the fungus on pruning tools and other equipment was definitely a problem. You can see it in this picture here, that basically has spread down the hedge as those infested, contaminated pruning tools were used. Now, even though the spores themselves are not easily windborne, we know that those microsclerotia survive in the leaves, and they can survive in studies out in the field. They have survived for 5 years and possibly more. So the microsclerotia are in those dead leaves, and they can germinate under the right conditions and produce spores. So if you move those infected leaves around by lawnmowers or leaf blowers, then you're going to create a situation where you could get new infections somewhere else. And the sticky spores can certainly stick to animal fur. And if you have animals moving through the hedges and so forth, then they could certainly spread those spores. The spores don't last for very long, not on a plant. So that's a good thing. But, if you're within, they'll probably survive for a couple of days on an animal and could be transmitted that way. Of course, humans are animals too. So if people are working in your boxwood, or you're working in your boxwood, and you have the spores on your clothing or your shoes, you could be carrying it in. So you want to be aware of that. And here we see a picture of some people. We were out looking at a site that was infested. These people are from the Virginia Department of Ag and Consumer Services, and we're putting on disposable booties before we walk into this infested field. What about greenery? Can the disease be transmitted on greenery? And, you know, a lot of people in Virginia love boxwood greenery, and it you know, we wreaths and garlands and so forth. And you put a nice boxwood wreath on your door, and if you've got a property like this where you've got some really nice boxwood on the property, you want to maybe think twice about putting that wreath on your door. You know, we know that the spores are not easily going to blow over to those healthy boxwood. And in fact, in the wintertime, when the temperatures are cold, the fungus is not active. So it's, you know, it's not likely that the disease is going to jump from your wreath to your healthy boxwood if the wreath has infected greenery in it. But it's mainly when you throw that wreath away, you want to be thinking about that. So a lot of people just toss the wreath on a coal pile after the holidays, or maybe try to compost it and not compost it properly. Then that fungus can, under the right conditions, produce spores, and it could be spread by some other means. So you want to take great care with your greenery after the holidays and not leave it laying around. And you may wonder why the boxwood in your wreath might be infected. And I think this map is very educational about that idea. So what you see here are some colored dots showing when we first diagnosed boxwood blight in a given county. So it doesn't really tell you anything about how widespread the disease is in an individual county, but it kind of shows you the time progression of how many counties we were seeing this disease in over time. And if you look, you see the red dot was that first year, 2011, and we had one case down in Carroll County in Southwest Virginia, and a case up in Fairfax that was actually a place where a plant had been sent to, and that was eradicated. But basically, ground zero for this epidemic in Virginia was Carroll County. There was a county in North Carolina right across the border where the disease was first found, and this nursery grower had property both in Virginia and North Carolina on either side of the border, and that grower had infected plants. Well, it turns out that Southwest Virginia, this area down here, is basically not only ground zero for the boxwood blight epidemic in Virginia, but also ground zero for the boxwood tipping industry, which is basically the collection of those shoot tips for use in holiday greenery. So there are a lot of people that their job is to go around and collect these boxwood tips, and they'll go pruning these tips from different boxwood. And a lot of you know, individual homeowners who just happen to have a bunch of old boxwood on their property, they'll let people come onto their property and collect those tips. And so, you know, the tippers are collecting from a lot of different properties, and the chances of collecting a boxwood blight infected tip is really high in an area where this disease came in. So, so definitely there's, you know, a high probability if greenery came from Virginia that it could be infected with boxwood blight. And that's one reason why you definitely want to inspect your boxwood greenery at the holidays before you would decide to use it. Now, another thing about this map that I want to point out is that you see there's suddenly a lot of dots, orange dots for 2016. So there was a great proliferation of the disease in 2016, and that was related to this sale of infected plants from one big box store that had stores all around the area. And it was first, we really noticed it around the Lynchburg area. So we were getting a lot of plants in the clinic, and we were asking people, how did you introduce any new plants into your landscape? Because we were trying to figure out how it was getting around. And everybody who we asked that had purchased plants from this one big box store. So that's when we got in touch with the Virginia Department of Ag and Consumer Services. They're the regulatory end of things, so they can go out and put a stop sale on somebody who's selling infected plant material. And so they went and inspected some of these places and communicated with the big box store, who they were very cooperative, and they had gotten their plants from the West Coast. So this went all the way to the West Coast and the Department of Ag out there, and the source nursery had a stop sale put on them. But unfortunately, the cat was out of the bag at that point, and you see that we had a lot of positive cases already before we figured out that this was going on. So there were a lot of new points of spread for the disease in Virginia after 2016. Another question that we frequently get is, will the disease kill my boxwood? And it typically will not kill your plants outright. So your plants may look really horrible, but they will often regrow. And so when people see them regrowing, they think, oh, this isn't so bad, I can keep my plants. The problem is then the fungus, hangs around on those plants and you never really get rid of it. And whenever the weather conditions are good, you're going to get severe defoliation. And so susceptible boxwood is going to be really ugly for a lot of the growing season. And if you get repeated defoliation year after year, then those plants will decline over time. So even if they're not killed right away, they will gradually decline. And you can see in this picture here, these plants were severely, severely defoliated, and they did come back, but do you really want those plants in your landscape? And so that's kind of the decision people end up having to make, is whether they want to remove all those plants or not. We'll talk more about that in a bit. If it also depends on the boxwood you have, whether the plant will cause the ultimate decline of your plants or not. So there's been a lot of trials of existing boxwood cultivars and species to see, if there's some difference in their reaction to the disease. And many cultivars have shown some resistance to this disease. And but the important thing to understand is that none of them is immune. So you can have resistance where you have a cultivar that doesn't develop as much leaf spotting and the symptoms aren't as bad, but you do get some leaf spots. And of course, the fungus can produce spores on those leaf spots. So you have to really be aware when you're buying, resistant varieties, that you're not, still introducing the disease, because those could act as a Trojan horse. If you bring in an infected resistant plant and plant it right next to an English boxwood, then I guarantee you that English boxwood will eventually get the disease. English boxwood is very, very susceptible, probably more so than any other boxwood. And of course, that's what you have a lot of down in your area. So how do you know for sure if your plants have boxwood blight? Basically, you can submit a sample through your local county extension office if you are concerned about possible boxwood blight, and we can diagnose it in our lab. So if the county agent can't diagnose it there right on site, they can send us a sample. That's not currently the case because of COVID-19. We basically had to go over to a policy of just sending us pictures for homeowner samples, because we weren't able to have everybody in the lab working on these samples. But hopefully that will change now that people are getting vaccinated. We're hoping to get back in the lab this season. Currently, you would have to just send pictures, but a lot of times we can diagnose this disease from pictures. But once we're back to our normal operations, then the kind of sample you would want to collect is 4 or 5 symptomatic branch samples. with the leaves still attached. So you don't want to wait till the whole plant has defoliated and send us that. We may not be able to diagnose it. You want to double bag those twigs in, Ziploc bags, so that leaves are not dropping out of the bags on their way to our lab and causing possibly infections along the way on the mail route. And then, a lot of times problems are not boxwood blight. As you saw from that graph earlier in my talk, we get a lot of boxwood samples that are not boxwood blight. And a lot of times boxwood will get root diseases or nematode problems. And so if you send us a soil and a root sample at the same time, put those in a separate plastic bag, then we can check for other diseases if we don't find boxwood blight. Just realize that the confirmation can take up to probably 10 days. If we don't find the spores right away, then we put the samples in what's called a moist chamber, so just a humid environment, and that'll stimulate spore production. And we wait at least 7 days to make sure something is negative before we would answer it. Okay, so, unfortunately, my April Fool's joke wasn't true, and we are still having to figure out how to manage boxwood blight in our landscapes. And it is a tricky proposition. So we don't have any one good way to get rid of boxwood blight, and it really requires a multi-pronged approach to try to keep it out of our landscapes. And then if we do get it in the landscape, keep it from spreading and deal with those plants. So you definitely want to start out from the beginning, not introducing infected plant material into your landscape. And so that involves buying plants from a reputable source. I generally don't recommend that you buy your plants from a big box store, because the people dealing with the plants there are not necessarily well-versed in plant material, and certainly not in boxwood blight. So they're going to be less likely to notice there's a problem if they get infected plant material. Whereas if you're buying from a reputable nursery source in Virginia, then you're much more likely to get clean plant material. And there are a number of nurseries in Virginia, wholesale nurseries, that participate in a program called the Boxwood Blight Cleanliness Program. And this is a program administered through the Virginia Department of Agriculture. And they have instructions on best practices to follow in their nursery to prevent introduction of infected plant material into their nursery. And then they also agree to periodic inspections. So the Virginia Department of Ag people will come out and inspect their nursery and make sure that the disease isn't there. So while you're not typically buying plants directly from a wholesale nursery, you can ask your retail nursery where they get their plants from, and say you want to get plants that are from a nursery that participates in this program and takes measures against boxwood blight. Of course, a lot of retail nurseries may get plants from all over the place, and the person you talk to may not know where the plants come. So I realize that that's kind of difficult to confirm that they're getting their plants from a good source, but it's good to ask, because it may get them to find out that information. So maybe your nursery person doesn't know where the plants came from. You want to make sure that you're familiar with the symptoms of boxwood blight, like I showed you in that earlier slide, and inspect your plants carefully before you buy them. If you see something like this plant here, where you've got a bunch of brown leaves and some defoliation, you do not want to buy that plant. But look carefully for those black streaks on the green stems, as well as the leaf spots, which can be symptoms of boxwood blight. And then, research, if you're planning a new planting, then do a little research online to find out what resistant varieties are available. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Like I said, resistant varieties aren't the be all and end all solution, because they could carry the disease, but they're going to perform a lot better in the landscape. And as long as you're not planting an infected plant material next to an English or American boxwood, you'll probably be okay, and you'll be less likely to have problems with these varieties. But also just beware of incredible sales. You know, if you see plants that are 40% off, you know, you get what you pay for. And this was literally the case in that problem that I showed you up in Fairfax County, where the woman had bought the plant and put in her planter. The VDAX people, the Virginia Department of Ag people, went up to inspect that situation. They went back to that retail nursery and went back in the back, and they had all these boxwood plants that looked like this one that had a 40% off sign on them. So you get what you pay for, and it's not worth buying these bad looking plants. They're not going to perform well, and they're probably going to spread the disease. So in addition to not introducing infected plant material, you want to avoid introducing any infected leaf debris. As we know, those microsclerotia can hang around on those dead leaves for a really long time. And, you know, or you don't want to introduce soil from a site that had boxwood blight, because there could be dead leaves in there with microsclerotia. If you're, you know, if you're a landscaper, then you're especially going to want to think about how you do your work. And I know probably many of you are not professional landscapers. Some of you may be, but it's still good to know what these landscapers should be doing from their perspective in case you hire a landscaper in your yard. So they should be working from low risk to high risk areas. You know, they should not be going into a site that they know has boxwood blight and then going and working in somebody else's property that has boxwoods on the site. And everybody in general should be very careful with leaf blowers and lawnmowers, especially on sites that have a history of boxwood blight, because there could be those infected leaves laying around. So beware of that. You know, landscapers probably want to have, if they've had a leaf blower or a lawnmower they've used on an infested site, they probably want to designate that for, you know, boxwood blight sites only, or else they want to do a really good sanitation job on that equipment. And you know, in general, people should be sanitizing their tools. Landscapers need to do that between sites, certainly. And a landscaper ideally would carry a sanitizer kit that would have, so they'd be prepared if they run into a boxwood blight site, that they can be sanitizing their tools, you know, if they're pruning, and be able to remove infested plant material and so forth. So these are some of the things you might look for in a landscaper, see if they're doing these things if you're hiring them. Just a few points about sanitizing tools and so forth. Basically, you always want to wash the plant debris and the soil from the tools first, because you're going to be able to, it's going to be harder to sanitize all the plant debris and soil on the tools. If you can just wash that off, then you're just sanitizing the tool. It's going to be more effective sanitation. And, you know, think about sanitizing your tools and hoses and equipment between blocks of plants or between properties. So if you're working in, you know, one of these beautiful public gardens, hopefully people are doing this who are pruning and doing those kinds of things in your beautiful public gardens down there. And some of the sanitizers that work include anything that has over 70% ethanol or isopropanol, or Lysol disinfectant spray brand 3. That specific Lysol product is a good sanitizer, and that one can be used as a spray or a dip. I mean, they can all be sprayed on, or you can dip your tools in them. The thing is that you need to realize that it's not just a like dip in and dip out. Basically, wipes are not effective in that case. These different sanitizers will have different optimum amounts of time that you need to dip your tools in them for them to be effective. And we have some information about that on our website that I'll talk about in just a little bit here. If you are hiring a landscaper, you want to make sure that landscaper has a plan for preventing introduction of boxwood blight into your property. So you might want to ask them how they sanitize their equipment, if they're sanitizing their equipment between properties. If you just ask them a few leading questions, you can probably tell whether they know what they're doing or not. If they ask you what boxwood blight is, or that they just don't think it's important to do that, then you may want to hire somebody else. So we have seen a lot more spread on pruning tools and that sort of thing since that original introduction into Virginia. So this is an important means of spread, and landscapers need to be aware. I think, a lot of the good landscapers are very educated about this disease and are taking measures against it. So again, wash leaf debris and soil also from vehicle tires before moving to a new site. So if you have been visiting someone on a property where they have boxwood blight, then if you can possibly hose down your car tires before you leave, that would help you to prevent spreading soil that could contain those infected leaves. And, if you're working in plants that have boxwood blight, then basically washing your clothes in hot water and drying them in a heated dryer will kill any spores that would be on your clothing. If you're a professional landscaper, then you might want to consider using disposable clothing and discarding it between sites, or, changing your clothes and washing them between sites. And as far as greenery goes, that is, at first we thought, well, it's a possible means of introduction. And we had a few anecdotal cases. I had someone call me who said that they had a long boxwood hedge, and at one end was their compost pile. And apparently the woman's husband had thrown a wreath on the compost pile, and the next season they basically saw boxwood blight moving down that hedge. So I don't know if those people are still married, but you want to avoid that in your family. So you can, of course, completely prevent this problem by avoiding using any greenery containing boxwood. Kind of sad, boxwood is very beautiful in greenery. But if you're using fir or spruce or something like that in your holiday greenery, you're not going to have any chance of introducing boxwood blight. So that's one approach. If you love boxwood greenery, then you just want to be sure that you're inspecting that greenery carefully and making yourself familiar with those symptoms of leaf spots and the black streaking on the green stems. If you see any of that, you do not want to purchase that greenery. And then, as a safety precaution, even if you didn't see any symptoms, if you're buying greenery containing boxwood, make sure you bag and discard it after the holidays. Don't just throw it on the compost pile. Don't just throw it out in the yard. You're just asking for trouble that way. Bag it and discard it. And do not compost it, because most people aren't actually composting properly, where all that material is getting down in the middle of the pile and getting hot enough to kill the fungus. Okay, this recommendation, avoid introducing the disease by animals, that's kind of a tough one, but just be aware that that is a potential means of spread. And so, in this left-hand picture, this was taken by a VDAX inspector. This dog was taking a break on the infected side of that boxwood plant. And so the dog is likely going to have spores on its fur that will be infected for, a day or two if it goes and rubs against some healthy plant. And of course, deer, are also possible vectors. So if possible, fence the wild animals out and the domestic animals in. Choose resistant cultivars for new plantings. There are quite a few of these now. There were trials that were done early on in North Carolina, and there are several other places where they're doing, multi-year trials of different boxwood plant material. So, keep yourself informed about that. You can find information online, and I'll show you a few things. And then we have some new cultivars that just came on the market in 2020 from one of our own wholesale nurseries in Virginia, Saunders Brothers. They have a long history of growing boxwood, and they have been on top of this disease from the get-go, and they even have their own breeding program. And they've come up with these boxwood cultivars called New Gen cultivars. One is called Independence, the other is called Freedom. Both of these showed very high levels of resistance to both boxwood blight and boxwood leaf miners, an insect problem that can also cause high levels of leaf drop on boxwood. So, you might protect your plant from boxwood blight and then get leaf miners. So it's great if you have one of these cultivars that's resistant to both of them. And there are other breeding programs in Belgium. They've had this disease in Europe a lot longer than we have. And so there are breeding programs in Europe, and we might, have access to some of those cultivars going forward. Just remember that resistance, or sometimes people call it tolerance, does not mean immunity. And so you still want to be wary of any new plant material and make sure you inspect it carefully before you put it in your landscape. Okay, here are some results of some of these trials that were done at NC State early on in the epidemic. And you can see on this list of where their cultivars and species fell out that English boxwood, Buxus sempervirens fruticosa, is very, very susceptible. I mean, that plant just looks at a boxwood blight spore and drops all its leaves. American boxwood is also very susceptible, just not quite as susceptible as English. So it'll often end up looking a little better if both of them are on the same property. But you'll see that there are a lot of other boxwoods, the little leaf boxwood and others, and specific cultivars that have really good resistance. So those are some of the ones that you'll want to choose for new plantings, in addition to those Saunders Brothers cultivars. So what if you have boxwood blight on your property? And what are you going to do to get rid of it? And we basically all along been saying the best thing to do is to remove it, because that can serve as a source of infection for other plants and other properties. So basically, removing infected plants and plant debris is the recommendation. And as we know, it's not easy to remove boxwood leaves because they're so small. Here's an example of a case where boxwood blight was remediated. It was a very sad story at the Woodrow Wilson Public Library up in Stanton. They had a beautiful boxwood garden, and you can see how widely this disease spread just from this picture here. And they decided that they were going to remediate by removing everything. And so they brought in a bulldozer and they basically cleared out all of those boxwood. It was really sad. And as they were removing them, they shrink wrapped each one of them so that they wouldn't be dropping those leaves as they removed them. I'm not sure what they have replanted with. I need to follow up on that. But you can see this was a real disaster for that garden. And I know you have similar places down in Williamsburg and surrounding areas. So it's very sad when this is the solution. And most people are going to say for their own yards that, I can't afford a bulldozer. What am I going to do if I want to remove things? So ideally you want to double bag infected plants when removing them so that you're not dripping, the leaf debris with the microsclerotia in them on the way out. So whatever you can do to avoid distributing that infected leaf debris during removal. And, there are landscapers, professional landscapers who specialize in boxwood blight and who are really good at doing this, but of course you pay for it. You want to think about removing other plants in the boxwood family, like Pachysandra and Sarcococca, if they're in the same landscape with a severe case of boxwood blight, because while they won't die themselves, they can serve as a source of inoculum. And then, because it's impossible to get rid of all those little leaves, you might consider torching the remaining leaf debris. That has been shown to get rid of the fungus. And then afterwards, when you replant, you can mulch the beds just to make a barrier layer between that leaf debris where often the infections start and the plants that you put in. So here's a study that was done by Anton Baudouin in our department and others, where they compared boxwood that had been mulched to boxwood that was just sitting there with the leaf debris, infected leaf debris around the plants. And they found that the plants with the wood chip mulch developed a lot less disease than the plants that were just sitting there in the boxwood leaf litter. So mulching can certainly help to cover up any potentially infected leaves. And here you can see why the infected leaves are a problem. So those microsclerotia are in the dead leaves. And if you provide the right conditions, like a wetting period of 3 days, you see that these spores are starting to form. In the picture on the left at 3 days, those are the fungal spores that are just starting to form. And you can see after 5 days, that microsclerotium has a lot of spore clusters on it. So it happens pretty quickly under the right conditions that new spores will form on those dead leaves. And then those spores will splash up onto the lower leaves. So you'll often see the disease moving up from the bottom of the plant because it's originating from that leaf litter. So the leaf litter, getting rid of the leaf litter is a really important part of managing this disease. Of course, it's not a silver bullet. You can have animals still moving through the mulch and dredging up some of those infected leaves. Some people have asked, what about, cutting the boxwood all the way back? We know boxwood will tolerate this, and that is a potential solution, and that will certainly get rid of the infected plant parts, and we know it's not a problem in the roots typically. So that's a possible approach, but it just depends. Do you want to wait for that boxwood to regrow? Boxwood is a slow grower, which is why it's often used for hedges. And, if you've still got leaf debris, then there's still the potential for infection of new growth. And so you might need to consider fungicide protection on the new growth. And speaking of fungicides, what about controlling the disease with fungicides? It's unfortunate we've never had any foliar diseases of boxwoods that we had to control with fungicides. But now that we do, there are fungicides that are effective for control, but it's important to understand they will not eradicate the disease from the plants or the soil. But there are protectant fungicides where if you spray them on the leaf surface, they will prevent infection if a spore lands on the leaves. But you're going to need repeated applications because those fungicides break down, and then you need a new barrier on the leaves. And unfortunately, this pathogen will survive and reproduce at a pretty wide range of temperatures. So basically between 60 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit is what we recommend. Actually at 86, it's not reproducing, but in that, moderately warm temperature range. And when rain is forecast, that's when a preventative spray of fungicide should be in place, protecting those leaves. So that means, you would be spraying fungicides for quite a bit of the growing season, and you would need thorough coverage to get good control. So fungicide control is basically too expensive and time consuming for most people. For a very valuable property, it can be considered and can be effective. There's research that's ongoing concerning biological control. So there are some fungi that have been found in leaf litter that are antagonistic to the Boxwood blight fungus, but none of those are formulated in a commercial product yet, but maybe we'll see that going forward. And some people have been doing research recently with antidesiccants, which are products that just prevent evapotranspiration, typically over the winter, so the leaves don't dry out. And those actually have shown effectiveness against the fungus infecting the leaves. So that might be a potential control measure going forward as well. So the biology of this pathogen, we know a lot about it now since it came in. A lot of research has been done. We know it can infect at temperatures as low as 41 degrees Fahrenheit, but basically don't get infection above 82 degrees Fahrenheit. We know that optimum temperature range is around 75, and that prolonged dry periods will definitely reduce infection. But unfortunately, those microsclerotia can survive for 5 or more years in the decomposing leaf litter and in leaves in the soil. So we know all this stuff, and some people out at Oregon State put all this information together into a Boxwood Blight risk model, and they figured out when it would be most likely for boxwood to be infected by this pathogen. And they've developed this into an app. You can either find it online at this URL, or you can download the app for either Android or iOS. And basically it looks like this on your screen. You put in your zip code, you tell them a start date when you want to look and see what the risk of boxwood blight infection is going to be. And you'll get this kind of an answer where it shows you the next 7 days in this case, and which day is the most likely for infection. And that's when you should have your fungicide in place. So if you're really into this, you can get into it to that degree. If it's a really expensive property, then you can figure out how to time those fungicide sprays appropriately. Okay, so I'm going to wind this up and just go over the lessons that we've learned about boxwood blight. Basically, that there's no silver bullets. The pathogen has a lot of ways to get
What
around.
blight is like
Pardon me?
on the Boxwood Blight.
Should I go on?
Yes, go on.
Okay, I've got a little few minutes. Okay. The pathogen has a lot of ways to get around, even though the spores don't blow around very easily. Remember that you may have control over your own property, but not your neighbors. And that can be a real problem if somebody is not careful on their property. And, we have a lot of people who just cut the boxwood out and go lay it by the roadside. And that's just going to allow leaves to spread around that could cause infection on other people's property. So we really need to educate the public about boxwood blight. And that's what this talk is about today. Try to encourage your neighbors not to leave their pruned infected boxwood on the roadside. We want to avoid also distributing infected leaf debris through community leaf mulch. So that can also be an issue. And some communities have barred boxwood from being put in the community leaf mulch for that reason, because of those microsclerotia that can hang around on the dead leaves. Make sure you're purchasing plants that are from a reputable grower. Maybe you can't figure out whether it was produced in the Boxwood Blight Cleanliness Program, but in general, if you buy plants that are sourced from a reputable grower, you're going to minimize your risk of introduction. And I think that, hopefully landscapers are being educated in these practices to prevent the spread of boxwood blight and prevent introduction. I think this is really important. And someone suggested to me one time, why don't we have a cleanliness program for lawn care and landscape personnel? And I think that's a great idea. So that's a potential extension program that would be good to pursue. Basically, how you manage this disease is going to depend on the value of the boxwood to the property, and how much you're willing to invest in controlling and managing the disease. And of course, we have a lot of beautiful properties like this one here that was taken by my colleague in Europe, and I know you have these kind of landscapes down in Williamsburg. And those, if you've got the money, you want to try to implement as many of these management protocols as possible to protect that boxwood. You can find more information about boxwood blight. I wasn't able to pack it all into this talk at our Virginia Boxwood Blight Task Force website online. And there we've got a lot of different information, including best management practices for different groups such as homeowners, landscapers, nurseries. We have a decision guide on there. So if you've got boxwood blight on your property and you're not sure what approach to take, there's sort of a general decision guide. We have information on sanitizers and how long to dip your tools and what fungicides work, as well as, resistant variety information. There are links to a list of short videos that I did on just different aspects of boxwood blight. We have images of what the disease looks like, and all of the frequently asked questions that we got on our survey are posted with answers there, as well as some lookalike problems that I didn't have time to cover. And we do have available this little laminated boxwood blight card. If you want to get that, you can talk to your extension agent. These can be ordered through the extension warehouse, and they have little pictures of the symptoms that you should look for to recognize this disease. So I went a little over my time. It's a lot of material to cover, but I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Mary Hatton, that was really comprehensive, really fabulous, and that was one of our best talks. I just really appreciate you doing such a great job with that. What I would like to do is, for those who don't have questions, I'd like to release you for your 10-minute break. We got a number of good questions in the chat box, and would like to ask those of you who put questions in, or those of you who would like to stay for the questions, to stay during the break. And I'd like to go ahead and invite those who put in questions and those who have questions to stay. Particularly if people ask questions, I'd like to go down one by one and ask you to unmute so you can ask the questions yourself. I think Sherry was first up with a question. Sherry, are you on?
I am. My question is on the Sarcococca and the other spurges. Do you see the black streaks on the stems like you see on the actual boxwood plant if the plant is infected?
Okay, good question. And I'll tell you the truth. I've only had one sample in on Pachysandra, and that Pachysandra was in pretty bad shape from another disease called Volatile blight. So I haven't seen it, but from what I've seen reported, you do not see those black streaks. All you see are some pretty innocuous looking leaf spots. And we are not seeing a lot of that in the landscape. It's just that if you're dealing with a landscape that has boxwood blight and people are going to the trouble of removing the boxwood, then you want to, just as a precaution, you want to remove the Pachysandra as well. Now, I will tell you that the most common disease on Pachysandra is this disease Volatile blight. And you'll get leaf spots with that, and you'll get stem dieback, but the stems will just turn totally brown. You won't see black streaks, and you'll often see the fungus, sporulating on there in these little kind of salmon colored clusters. And that is the most common disease on Pachysandra. If you've got a problem on your Pachysandra, that's probably what you've got. The boxwood blight would be a lot less noticeable.
Okay, thank you.
Pat Crow was asking where the Korean boxwood stand in the risk. Do you know where they were in your risk stratification? I
don't have all those memorized, but it really depends on the cultivar. So you really have to look at the specific cultivar, because there are actually even cultivars of Buxus sempervirens that have high resistance. So let's just go back.
Wait, I'm coming up for a question. You need it now.
You see there's quite a variety here of species and cultivars that have really good resistance. So you have some, Buxacinica variety Ancillera nana here is good. I don't see any other bucks. Yeah, so, but the Buxacinica variety Ancillaris Justin Brower's is highly susceptible. So you just want to look very carefully at the specific cultivar because there is a lot of variation in the response.
Okay, thank you. Peggy Kraft, are you on?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had two questions. One, has she seen any correlation between overhead irrigation and the spread of boxwood blight? Because she did mention, or Marianne, you mentioned that wet weather stimulates the production of spores. And I see a lot of people who over irrigate all of their plants. So I wondered if there was a correlation there. And then my second question is, if you have had boxwood blight, can you replant in the same place with resistant cultivars or use them other places in the same yard?
Okay, I love those questions. Those are great questions. And you've given me some ideas for adding some material to my next presentation. Definitely overhead irrigation is a bad idea. In studies, it's clear that the prolonged leaf wetness is very conducive to boxwood blight under the right temperatures. So that's a very good point. Watering from below is recommended over watering from above. Of course, with boxwood blight, if you've got infected leaf debris under the plant, then you're moistening those leaves and allowing that fungus to reproduce as well. So, watering in general is going to be a problem, but you got to decide if it's too dry, you've got to water. And then watering from below would be better than watering from above. And, those spores are not windblown, but they can be splashed. And so definitely overhead irrigation is not a good idea. And in general, it's not a good idea for most plants because many fungal diseases are spread that way. So we say that like in your vegetable garden, you want to water from below and not overhead irrigate if you can avoid it. Okay, planting resistant varieties. Okay, if it were my yard and I had had boxwood blight and I had had it all removed and I loved boxwood and I wanted to put boxwood back in there, I would not worry about buying one of these highly resistant varieties. I would definitely do everything I could to remove the old leaf debris before I replanted. Maybe even torching that area, and then I would definitely put in a good layer of mulch and just make sure it was renewed every so often. And I think if you don't have really susceptible boxwood on your property, then there's no reason to worry at all, really, because even the resistant varieties, if they get a leaf spot or two, that's not going to be a big deal. The problem is if you plant it next to an English boxwood that you care about, or if your neighbor has English boxwood and you're planting on that side of the yard or something. So yeah, I highly recommend those resistant cultivars for new plantings. Just be aware that it's not, they're not immune.
Okay.
Does that answer your questions?
It does. I guess I'm more thinking of if you had a client, and I'm a landscape designer, so I work with clients. If they had, say, a hedge of boxwood and had a problem with blight, didn't want to lose the whole hedge, if we intersperse some of the resistant varieties to try to fill in the space rather than pull everything out, or is it too risky once you've had blight in your yard? Is it too risky to plant any kind of boxwood? And what I found interesting was your comment that it does not spread through the roots. And I think that's why most people hesitate to replace the same plant that's had a disease. But if it's not spreading in the roots and you take care of all the leaves and you get rid of everything, what is the risk of putting more boxwood in your yard?
Okay. Well, your scenario there with the hedge, like say you had a hedge of a highly susceptible cultivar and you had just a section of it going out from boxwood blight. I think you're going to have to use your judgment on that. You know, whenever you remove, you're going to want to have very thorough removal. And so if you remove that section, have very thorough removal of the leaf debris from under those plants, and be very, very careful that you're not spreading it as you remove that from the property. Then if it were me, and if the person really didn't want to get rid of that whole hedge and you felt like you could find a resistant variety that would grow to the same general size as what they've got, you know, I would try that. Then you could just keep doing that. You know, if it develops in another part of the hedge, you could keep doing that so that you eventually replace the whole hedge if you have to, and not if you don't have to. So it's like I said, the even infected boxwood will refoliate. You know, if something had a minor infection, it'll refoliate, but you'll eventually see the symptoms under the right conditions. You know, I mean, you have to use your judgment on these situations with your clients, because if, you know, if they really do not want to remove that boxwood, then it's probably worth trying to replace. But you just educate them, like, this is the risk. The risk is that it's going to show up elsewhere in the hedge. We either replace the whole hedge or we replace parts of it and monitor it, but we're going to be monitoring it going forward. If they are a client who wants to spend a lot on their boxwood, then I would say, yeah, remove that section, replace with something resistant, and put fungicide on the rest of the hedge if they want to protect it. And basically chlorothalonil is a protectant fungicide that is readily available and is one of the most highly effective fungicides at preventing this disease. It's just that it has to be, you know, in place when the conditions are right. So I have a black and white answer to that. It really is going to depend on the client.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Jenny, you had a question
I
about soil.
think that it was almost covered from Peggy, but I remember in the beginning, you were removing, we were told to remove the soil.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how much of the soil should you remove, and how are you going to dispose of all of this?
Yeah.
Does it go just to the landfill?
Yeah, I guess it depends on your locality, where it goes. You know, I mean, the reason for anyone saying that the soil should be removed is that there could be dead leaves in it that are infected. So I don't know how deep down those leaves end up getting, but I would imagine, you know, they're probably in the top 3 or 4 inches of soil anyway. So, you know, I don't know where soil goes in your community. I can't really answer that.
Well, it depends upon how you dispose of it.
Yeah.
But
But it's not the soil itself, it's the infected leaves in the soil.
right.
So that's why, you know, if you mulch and if you keep that mulch layer there, then you're going to prevent any, you know, if you torch the soil surface, you're going to kill all the leaves on the soil surface. And then if you mulch, you'll prevent any, you know, few leaves that manage to come up to the surface from being sort of the plants being exposed to them. So, you know, I would say 3 or 4 inches of soil and get rid of it however you're allowed to in your community if you want to do that. But I think torching the soil surface and mulching will probably be almost as effective.
I think we have time for just one more question, or Marty's going to ding me with his bell. But I I think, Dave, you had a question about the fungicides. Are you here?
Yes, and she answered, she told us the fungicide, and so I have that, but just as a preventive measure, I mean, when and under what circumstances would a master gardener doing a home visit, doing a landscape love visit, recommend that people apply a preventative fungicidal treatment to their boxwood?
When would a master gardener recommend that?
Yes.
Was that the
Under what
question?
circumstances? Yeah, people
Under
are
the
like really concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much you guys do those kind of recommendations. But I would say that's up to the client. And of course, if they've got a property like on that last slide that I showed, then
Yeah.
you might want to recommend that.
Okay.
And there has been some good results with that, if people are, but mainly it's been when they have a landscaper who knows what they're doing and is probably using that risk model to figure out when to spray. There have been some good results. I heard from a colleague in Tennessee with, a landscaper who was doing that on a fancy property. So I wouldn't recommend that for, somebody who doesn't have a really kind of expensive boxwood property, because it's going to be really expensive. And if they're just spraying the fungicides themselves, they're probably not going to have the fungicides on there always at the right time. There's just so much of the year when the plants are susceptible. We get the samples in the fall, like all through the fall, from August to December. So you're going to have a fungicide in place a lot of the time, especially if you're just kind of doing it on a 7 to 10 day basis, like the fungicide says on the label, and you're not using the risk model. So for your average homeowner, I would not recommend fungicide treatment as an answer. But for a very expensive property where people are willing to spend the money, then I would suggest that as an option. And I would recommend that they get a landscaper who knows what they're doing.
Thank you.
Mary, and that was wonderful. I can't thank you enough for coming to our group and presenting. Very educational for all of us, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you
Thank you all
doing
for
this for us today.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.